All right, everybody. I know it's a little late in the game, but let me go ahead and get a couple of quick recaps going. So, this is for chapter 17. I just wanted to go ahead and wrap that up and get it out here for you. And I'll probably get to 18 this evening, too. So, we hope. All right, so let's jump right into it. So, chapter 17. After the Civil War, the westward migration was basically fueled by a various amount of different things, right? So, you had gold rushes, you had the Homestead Act, you had, of course, the railroads really being built and taking off, which is going to cause a lot of westward migration because now people can get out there a lot easier and get access to the things that they need a lot faster, a lot easier. So tools, seeds, and if you are engaged in business, getting your goods and services back to the east or farther west or whatever to customers became a lot easier. You had mining towns flourishing, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of ancillary operations going. So even if you didn't make money on the gold field, and most people didn't, you were still able to make money, as a cook, as a seamstress, people doing the work, like I said, the actual building, the roads, just the infrastructure in general. You also had bison pelts. They were used in the development of machinery as belts, on in some of that heavier equipment. They were also used for coats and belts that people wear as well. But of course, the rotting flesh, was just kind of left out there, and it just horrible. It smelled horrible. It also destroyed the Native Americans' lifestyle, the people who depended on the buffalo. So we saw that with that. The buffalo and bison being destroyed. Okay, now once the bison was gone, cattle ranching became a more readily available source of meat, and leather as well, and that's something that also was helped along by the railroads. Mormons were migrating towards the west, and they believed that during the 18 years or so before, kind of what happened between Christ being, a 12-year-old in the temple to the time he turned 30 when his ministry began, they said he was in in North America, talking with the Native Americans and so forth. So that was kind of something that they put in their testament of the Mormon Bible that they have. Saying that Joseph Smith, their founder, had a visitation by an angel named Moroni. They also believed in polygamy. Okay, so there's a lot of things going on within pedophilia was a big thing also in their community. So, but some of the good things about with the Mormons is they got established there in Utah, and their area really kind of became sort of the last stop, if you will, the last call for alcohol, y'all, if you were moving from east to west. So before you made that final westward migration on into Nevada or California, you could stop, rest, get supplies, etc. In Utah, in one of the Mormon cities. Okay, most of the history books, including ours, we tend to point out how both sides, the settlers and the Native Americans, were often wary of each other and being kind of non-cooperative. There was no room for cooperation when your people are being slaughtered, your women are being raped, your kids are being murdered. There's kidnapping your children, putting them on in these schools, these boarding schools. So I think it's a little disingenuous to, say, oh well, they could have sought peace. Well, there was no peace to be had. Every time the Native Americans would enter into a so-called peace treaty, that treaty with the settlers, with the Europeans, were always, without fail, canceled out by the Europeans. They would go back on their word before the ink was even dry. Oh no, if you just move a little further west, just a little bit further, all that's going to be for you. That's all you, until we want it 5 minutes later, and here we come to take it. So that's a major thing. Gender roles were defined very differently between the Native Americans and most of course, the European settlers. One thing is that women in Native American culture, they did the tending of the ground. They, growing crops or, in those kind of situations. That was women's work, not men's work. So when the Europeans began to impose their mindset and worldviews and gender norms onto the Native Americans, there was a psychological toll that was taking on the people as well. And to them, men did the hunting. They did, the manly stuff. They protected them and, just different things like that. They didn't farm. Okay, so very, very different perspectives. So General William Tecumseh Sherman, he actually wrote about one of his just the horrific conditions when he visited the reservations, talking about the people were nearly starving and just how horrible the situation really was. So he was sending that information back. Natives in California were also being forced into slavery. So all a white person had to do was just go and grab someone, usually a child, but they did it with adults too. But they would go and just and drag them before the magistrate and say, hey, I'm going to feed them, clothe them, and teach them a trade to help civilize them. And, they were forced to, with no legal recourse, they were forced into this slave situation, from anywhere between 10 to 20 years. So again, when you think about, for many of us who are young, right? Think about being, 15, 16 years old. And the next 20 years is the period of your life where, for a woman, you are, trying to get married, to raise a family, to have children. For a man, you want to, establish yourself, do whatever according to your culture is what a man does in preparation to have a family and himself. Well, you're being stripped of that. You can't do anything because you're somebody's slave for 20 years. So, with no legal recourse. So that was a major thing. Again, we talked about the native schools, how horrific a place that was. First of all, they were being kidnapped literally from their families, stolen from their parents. The boys were having their hair cut off, which was one thing about it. If you go back into the Old Testament, understanding who these people are, being part of the lost tribes of the northern kingdom, right? So you only cut your hair off during a time of mourning. So if you go back and you read, some of the prophets, Isaiah, some of the different prophets, they would talk about how, they would put on sackcloth and, they would cut their hair and things like that. That was to show extreme sorrow and guilt or shame about something or just being in mourning. So to have your hair cut off as a young man, that was a very emotional, traumatizing, event. So there was that. Also, we know later when we start excavating some of these sites where these boarding schools were, you were finding hundreds of bodies of children. Okay, so these children were being starved, beaten to death, sexually abused. We think about trafficking now. This is trafficking. This is exactly what was going on in many, many, many cases. Those babies were never going back home. Okay. The railroads employed many people, but the work was very, very hard. It was very dangerous, and it paid very little. We also see that most of the people who were working in, especially the most dangerous parts of the jobs, were either Irish immigrants or they were Chinese immigrants, okay, from the West Coast. In 1893, we had the Chicago World Fair, which featured things like the fluorescent light, woohoo, the Ferris wheel, the zipper, and a dishwasher. Everybody's favorite dishwasher, right? We talked a little bit about the Dawes Act and how it was an attempt, to kill the Native Americans culturally. So the few who were left, and said, oh, well, let's go do something really wonderful for them. Let's give them 160 acres of land for each, Native American man and family so that they can become farmers. Well, we already talked about that a little bit, how that was not something Native American men did. But okay, even if they're going to try and go along with that just for the sake of not starving to death, having something for their families, well, this was one of your first, as I mentioned before, DEI initiatives, right? However, you turned right around and you had what's called the $5 Indian. So the $5 Indian is when somebody who's white, because this is who it was, white people, were paying $5 to have documentation drafted claiming that they were Native Americans. Why? So that they can go and get the 160 acres of free land. So very few Native Americans ever got the land. It was given primarily to more white settlers. So nothing to see there. The ghost dance. So it was more of a pacifistic approach that relied on, God to fight their battle, and they believed that if they would engage in this, this kind of this ritual, this rite, praising God and giving him the glory and the honor that he would, like he'd done for them in the past. When you go back and read in Chronicles and in the Book of Kings, that many times, God would go out and fight for them, as well. So they believe that this would happen again. And so that was an approach that they took. And many of the different Native American cultures and groups at the time did participate in that. Okay. You also had magazines like the Virginian, popularizing the idea of the cowboy. So this kind of stoic, brave, rugged individual, that we, built all these movies like John Wayne, his characters often played. We saw television shows like The Rifleman, etc. So all of these ideas about these cowboys who protected people from, those bloodthirsty Indians and cattle rustlers and train robbers, so they were these rugged, rough and tumble guys. That was also pushed on by different rodeo shows and traveling, cowboy and Indian shows. So we start seeing things like, Annie Oakley and, she's the greatest shot in the West and, the quick draws and, just a lot of the culture that we have surrounding, how the West was won allegedly and, the famous, idea, or at least the push narratives of cowboys and Indians, which we know was hugely falsified. Okay. You also had Turner putting in his famous speech. He said that westward expansion was actually more about civilizing the natives than conflict and exploitation. Like there's no real exploitation here. We're civilizing them. See, we've got the Dawes Act. See, we're giving them land to cultivate. So very naive, very disingenuous ideas. He also cited that the expansion for giving America its hustle and drive. And, to some degree, I would even almost agree personally with some of that. The idea of, you can get out here and you can make it on, make it. You just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You can, if you've got the hustle, if you've got the drive, you can make anything happen. So there was, kind of that's part of the American identity, especially when we think about westward expansion, the Wild Wild West and how the West was won eventually. So, however, that point or that viewpoint was very much blatantly Anglo-Saxon, very chauvinistic, and it ignored the contributions of the Chinese immigrants and the Mexican immigrants or the blacks who were actually who were migrating west. Okay. The exodusters, speaking of blacks moving west, the blacks left the South in record numbers at the end of Reconstruction. And even though the racist sentiment was basically, oh, you can go get out of here, we don't need you, you can go back to Africa and all this different stuff. The truth of the matter is, when black people started leaving, those white folks panicked. They panicked because their economy, their entire economy is based on cheap labor. And if the labor source says, okay, I'm deucing out, goodbye, love, peace, and hair grease, what do? You do everything you can to stop that flow. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in chapter 18. But many blacks left the South between 1877 at the end of Reconstruction. And there were a few different waves, if you will, of the migration. But between 1877 and 1930, roughly 6 million blacks left the South. Okay, so that, over 25%. Okay, so we're going to get into that a lot more in detail. We're going to talk a little bit about lynching and how it was a violent tactic that was used to terrorize black Americans starting again after Reconstruction. Well, as Reconstruction ended, as the last Union troops left the South and headed back north, it was open season. Black men were the primary target, but black women and children were often, caught in that and were subjected to a lot of that. But black men were the primary targets. Part of the reasons for the violence was to try and enforce that racial hierarchy that they, white supremacy in the term that we're commonly using it in. Excuse me. That idea that, this is what it was about. But in actuality, it wasn't. It was about competition. Being barred at every angle from owning property, being not disallowed from engaging in any work that wasn't in the farm, being forced to sign these employment contracts that were basically signing yourself back into slavery, demonizing everything that blacks did kind of naturally, or things they had no control over, like you were homeless or you were unemployed just coming out of slavery. That was a jailable offense. And of course, they conveniently made the stipulation in the amendment that, yes, you're free unless you commit a crime. And if I make being unemployed a crime, then I can put you back in slavery under my prison industrial complex that was getting started. So this is exactly what's happening at that time. We also started to talk about the destruction of black towns when blacks said, they left the South, or even sometimes in the South, just building their own little enclaves. They began to outpace other groups because they had that hustle and drive. They were pulling themselves up. They had the skills. They were working. They were engaging in things that, supported themselves and their community, right? White people could not have that, so they had to burn those towns out. And we talked about the area of Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, known as Black Wall Street. People tend to focus on that one because it was sort of the shining jewel of black accomplishment, with more millionaires just in that small area than across the country. I mean, out of the two airports that was in the state of Oklahoma, one of them was ours, was the black community, because for the planes that they had, individuals owning planes. So they were leveled out, but they weren't the only one. I mean, there are dozens of black towns that met the same fate. Also, individual blacks all through the South, and we'll talk about the North as well, who, you opened up a store, you opened up a shop. Well, you're too successful. We're going to have to burn you out. So this is what was going on. It wasn't just with the lynchings, just blacks being hung on trees, burned alive, etc. It was, even, your, of course, your stores and your livelihood, your homes being burned out as well. Ida B. Wells Burnett, she is one who spoke very publicly on the real reasons for lynching, having nothing to do with black men chasing white women. It was, or being interested in white women, or misogyny, which is a lot of times what the excuse was used. Oh, that Negro man looked at a white girl, he winked at her, or he whistled at her, or just whatever they wanted to say. But in actuality, that black man had a store or a business that was successful. That's simply put. We're going to get more into that. All right. So that's sort of chapter 17 in a nutshell, if you will. And we are going to jump over and take a look at chapter 18. We'll be going through that lecture tomorrow as well, but I'm going to kind of give it to you a little bit early, some of the highlights, if you will. We'll talk more in detail in class, but I want you guys to go ahead and have that ready to go. Okay? All right. We'll talk to you guys soon.